Vietnam has emerged as one of the most developed countries in the world, pushing away its turbulent history of being colonized and involved in wars by China, France, Japan, and the USA. Vietnamese attempt to court Asia-Pacific powers such as India and Japan have been mainly driven by their concerns about the significant Chinese role in the region, particularly its hegemony in South China Sea. Since the 1980s, the state has played a significant role by launching a policy of Doi Mai, or market socialism. As a result, Vietnam has come out of isolation, being one of the poorest countries in the world, to a relatively developed nation. The geographical location of Vietnam and its foreign policy has played a vital role in the development process. Vietnam occupies one of the most demanding environments from a policy-making standpoint. Saigon, officially known as a Ho Chi Minh City with its 9 million population, is the second most populous settlement in the country. It accounts for approximately a third of national GDP. Most of its industrial and manufacturing industries are located there. Saigon is also more liberal, whereas Hanoi, the capital with 5 million population, is more conservative. Vietnam economically is dependent on China, especially with the latter is now the second most powerful country in the world. Nearly a third of Vietnamese trade is with China. Hence, Vietnam has to maintain a balanced approach regionally and globally. So how has Vietnam managed its foreign policy since the 1980s? What has been the implications of this for the country? We attempt to answer these questions by, one, to provide 2 short videos of geopolitical location of Vietnam and its history of colonization and wars. 2, a short lecture by Professor Long to examine the evolution of Vietnamese foreign policy since the 1980s. 3, what lesson the other countries in the Third World can learn from Vietnamese foreign policy.
Vietnam is located on the easternmost edge of the Indo-Chinese peninsula, with China to the north and Laos and Cambodia to the west. Its more than 2,000-mile-long coastline abuts the Gulf of Tonkin, the South China Sea, and the Gulf of Thailand. These seas create both direct access to the wider Pacific Ocean and a critical buffer to Vietnam's long and narrow land territory. Modern Vietnam consists of 2 geographic and population cores: the Red River Delta in the north, home to the capital of Hanoi, and the Mekong River Delta in the southern lowlands, where Ho Chi Minh City sits.
To understand the attitude of the Vietnamese during the war, one must first be aware of Vietnam's history of occupation and exploitation by foreign powers. First, there was China, which spent 1,000 years trying to absorb the nation through both conquest and cultural assimilation. However, by the 19th century, China was undergoing its own negative experiences with colonialism, as powerful European empires began expanding into Asia and destroying the old status quo. With Chinese influence on the wane, it seemed as if Vietnam might have a chance to stand on its own, but a small squadron of French warships would promptly crush those hopes. Unable to resist this technologically superior foe, the Nguyen imperial dynasty, ruling Vietnam at the time, quickly capitulated, and by 1884 most of Vietnam had become part of the Greater Colonial Union of French Indochina. With the Nguyen court reduced to a puppet administration, colonial governors operated with virtually no oversight from the French state and were allowed to use any and all means at their disposal to suppress any hint of native resistance. Often this extended to the point of criminalizing the mere act of identifying oneself as Vietnamese. Trapped in a thoroughly miserable existence, the Vietnamese peasants were desperate for a savior, any savior. But after decades of failed revolts and horrific reprisals, the iron grip of colonialism remained as strong as ever. Yet, unbeknownst to the peasantry, the seeds of a new revolution were already being sown, not in the plantations or even in the courts of the Nguyen bureaucracy, but in the coffee houses of Paris, where the few Vietnamese lucky enough to scrape together enough money to afford a Western education were debating the merits of a strange, radical new ideology known as communism. Unlike any political ideology at the time, communism promised freedom and equality for those laboring under the yoke of capitalistic imperialism, and so spread like wildfire from the moment it was introduced from overseas, becoming Vietnam's dominant underground political movement by the early 1930s. Central to the communist movement in Vietnam was the unassuming son of a disgraced bureaucrat called Nguyen Sinh Quong, or as he is more commonly known, Ho Chi Minh. After leaving Vietnam sometime in the 1910s, Ho Chi Minh drifted around Europe, visiting both the United States and possibly Britain. As early as 1918, he was a dedicated anti-imperialist, joining the group of Vietnamese patriots, which petitioned the French government for independence during the Treaty of Versailles. In 1920, he was one of the many communists avidly following the progress of Vladimir Lenin's October Revolution in Russia, the success of which proved beyond any doubt that the imperialist system could be overthrown through force of arms. Inspired by Lenin's success, Ho Chi Minh chaired the first meeting of what would become the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, or ICP, in 1930, with the express goal of ending colonial rule of his native country. But for all of his early efforts, regime change in Vietnam would not originate with the Vietnamese, but would instead be instigated from the most unlikely of sources, Imperial Japan. In 1940, Japan invaded Vietnam as part of their efforts to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or in other words, a series of client states under imperial domination. In 1945, they officially annexed the country and expelled all Western influences, including the entire French colonial administration. Mere months later, the Japanese surrendered to the Allies, and with their collapse, Vietnam's century-old political order had come crashing down, leaving total chaos in its wake. It was during this last chaotic year of the occupation that Ho Chi Minh truly came into his own as leader. He had returned to Vietnam in 1941 to organize a major resistance movement against Japanese forces known as the Viet Minh, and by 1945 he was leading an army of at least 10,000 communist guerrillas. His long-awaited revolution began on August 15th, before even the ink on the Japanese instrument of surrender had time to dry. With the French colonial forces in Vietnam having been disarmed by the Japanese earlier that year, there was a brief window in time where the Viet Minh had free run of the entire country. But far from screaming defiance at the hated Western imperialists, Ho Chi Minh was instead positively desperate to secure a friendship with the United States. This was due in large part to the activities of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which had made contact with the Viet Minh in 1945 and selected Ho Chi Minh as their primary contact within Vietnam. Part of what enabled the close relationship between America and the Viet Minh was their lack of a traditional communist agenda. Despite Ho Chi Minh's unabashed belief in the ideology, his primary goal was always the liberation of Vietnam. As he himself stated, at first patriotism, not yet communism. As a result, both Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong initially distrusted Ho Chi Minh for his unwillingness to make class warfare a priority above national freedom. This, however, struck a chord with American observers, who were naturally sympathetic to the idea of an oppressed nation throwing off the shackles of a domineering imperialist regime. Thus, OSS operatives celebrated alongside the peasantry when Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd, 1945. In his opening speech, he began with words familiar to every American.
Tất cả mọi người đều sinh ra có quyền bình đẳng. tạo hóa cho họ những quyền không ai có thể xâm phạm được. Trong những quyền ấy có quyền được sống, quyền tự do và quyền mưu cầu hạnh phúc.
Behind him on the podium stood OSS Major Archimedes Patty, and as the speech came to a close, a plane bearing US markings flew over the assembled crowd, which greeted its appearance with thunderous applause. All across the nation, Americans were seen as heroes and liberators, and for a moment, it seemed as if this would be the start of a glorious new relationship between East and West. Of course, we all know that this was never really an option. The French wanted their colonies back, and the newly elected President Truman had no interest in cooperating with an openly communist regime. After negotiations with the French broke down completely, the Vietnamese had no choice but to fight for their independence, and the First Indochina War began on December 16, 1946. During this time, the Nguyen dynasty attempted to reassert its control over the nation, with the 13th emperor, Bao Dai, siding with the French and resuming his place as a puppet ruler over their occupied territories. As the war dragged on, the US began sending aid to the French, but after their dramatic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they agreed to new negotiations with the Viet Minh. The ensuing treaty split the country in two halves, the DRV in the north and the state of Vietnam in the south. Bao Dai was then unceremoniously ousted by his prime minister, Ngo Dien Diem, after a referendum determined that the state of Vietnam should become a republic. However, this was hardly a triumph of democracy over imperialism, for Diem was utterly corrupt, and the referendum was blatantly rigged. Diem even went so far as to deliberately ignore the French promise that the South would be allowed to vote on whether or not to reunite with the North under the DRV. From the outset of war, Vietnamese generals knew that a conventional victory was impossible. America was simply too powerful to defeat using traditional battlefield tactics. But the huge rural population of the South was already mostly under the sway of the DRV-backed National Liberation Front, or more commonly known as the Viet Cong, or VC. The VC, in combination with the People's Army of Vietnam, waged a successful series of campaigns against the disorganized South Vietnamese until large numbers of American troops began arriving in 1965. Following American involvement, the conflict began to shift into a war of attrition. Vietnamese defense strategy revolved around their extensive network of tunnels, which many likened more to underground cities than mere military strongholds. Over 200 miles or 321 kilometers of tunnel were dug during the war, with the largest system at Cu Che being just 20 miles or 32 kilometers outside Saigon. Their importance was summed up in the words of Colonel Chow Lam. We knew the Americans were determined to find and destroy the tunnel system. They understood, as did we, however Cu Che went, so did the war. It was our determination not to lose even 1 centimeter of the tunnels. It was a contest of wills, resulting in some very fierce fighting. We made a tremendous sacrifice to gain victory. 2 years after its arrival, the United States of America expanded its bombing campaigns across North Vietnam in an effort to break their will to fight. When a North Vietnamese civilian saw the first B-57 bombers open their bomb bays over his home province of Quang Minh, his first thought was not to flee in panic, but was instead, why is a mother airplane dropping baby airplanes? Having miraculously survived the initial attack, he gathered his family and fled for the nearby caves. He later recalled to a journalist, "People didn't talk about the meaning of the war. We were really confused why the Americans tried to invade our homeland. We hadn't done anything to them." Sadly, the citizens of Vietnam had much more to fear than American bombs. When Viet Cong guerrillas went to ground among the rural peasantry, US forces responded by declaring any villages with a suspected VC presence as free fire zones. Then came the infamous My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968, when at least 347 unarmed civilians were brutally executed by American soldiers. Although the heroic actions of a US helicopter crew saved a few innocent lives, most were not so fortunate. and My Lai would go on to become known as the worst war crime ever perpetrated by US soldiers in Vietnam. As traumatizing as the war was for the civilian population, it was arguably just as bad for the Vietnamese soldiers on account of how long most were expected to serve on the front lines. Lê Cao Dai, head of surgery at a military hospital, later recalled, "When we were called to go south, everyone was very excited. As it turned out, while I only planned to stay for 6 months, I ended up staying for 8 years." Given these extended deployment times, Vietnamese soldiers quickly became hardened to the horrors of war, and had little mercy for any Americans unfortunate enough to fall into their grasp. American pilots were especially loathed due to their indiscriminate bombing campaigns, and many were tortured to death after they bailed out over Vietnamese territory. To keep their populace motivated and stave off the effects of war weariness, the DRV maintained strong and effective propaganda campaigns throughout the conflict. The mastermind behind these campaigns was Vo Nguyen Giap, a renowned military leader who had fought alongside Ho Chi Minh since the 1940s. People quickly formed long queues to purchase his newspapers and listen to loudspeaker broadcasts about the latest developments on the front lines. With minimal access to international news, the people of the North were easily swayed by party rhetoric, and quickly came to regard the war as a necessary and righteous struggle against yet another imperialist aggressor. By contrast, the urban population of the South could listen to foreign news reports and had a much more conflicted attitude towards the violence tearing apart their nation. The success of the Vietnamese propaganda machine was demonstrated following the Tet Offensive of 1968, which caught US forces completely by surprise. Amidst the chaos, VC infiltrators launched an attack on the American embassy in Saigon, penetrating the compound and opening fire on the Chancery building with rocket-propelled grenades. Although the building withstood the assault, the fact that such an attack had occurred at all was psychologically devastating to the USA, proving that not even the capital city of South Vietnam was safe from communist infiltration. The Tet Offensive also brought the reality of war to the urban population of the South, leading many to lose confidence in the Western-backed government. By the early 1970s, the endless jungle warfare had taken their toll on both sides. But the DRV remained defiant, while US morale had plummeted to the point where soldiers were openly ignoring orders and deserting in record numbers. Desperate to at least preserve the status quo, America began pouring resources into strengthening the South Vietnamese army while pulling out its own traumatized troops out of the conflict. But it was too little, too late, and in 1975, a massive offensive by the DRV known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign smashed through the defenses around Saigon and decapitated the Republic. After almost 20 years of war and millions of deaths, the DRV finally stood triumphant. Against all odds, communism had won.
The world in the 21st century continues to witness complex and unpredictable changes. Deepening globalization exerts impacts on all countries. Countries, large or small, have been actively engaged in international integration. Last decade and the next decade present both opportunities and challenges. Following nearly 3 last decades of carrying out the Đổi mới renewal policy, Vietnam's strength and position have been significantly improved. The country possesses the great advantage of political and social stability. We implement consistently the foreign policy line of independence, self-reliance, peace, cooperation, and development. The foreign policy of openness and diversification and multilateralization of international relations. Proactively and actively engage in international economic integration while expanding international cooperation in other fields. Vietnam is a friend and reliable partner of all countries in the international community, actively taking part in international and regional cooperation processes. The task of foreign policy and foreign activity consists of solid preservation of peaceful environment and creation of favorable international conditions for renewal, accelerated socio-economic development, national industrialization and modernization, and construction and defense of the homeland, while contributing actively to the common struggle of the world people for peace, national interdependence, independence, democracy, and social progress. Vietnam's foreign policy has pursued these twin goals quite consistently despite changes in the top leadership. Vietnam consolidated its multi-directional foreign policy and multilateralization of relations by forging strategic partnerships and pursued a policy of proactive international integration. Overall, the current course in Vietnam's foreign policy is still the most logical and sensible as long as Vietnam's top priority remains to avoid unnecessarily alienating China while hedging against other major powers to protect Vietnam's strategic autonomy. So there are three levels: comprehensive strategic partnership, and comprehensive partnership. The famous three no's of Vietnamese defense policy: no foreign troops on Vietnamese soil, no allying with one country to counter another, and last but not least, no military alliances with foreign powers. And here are key partners of Vietnam up to now. We can see China, India, Russia, Japan, US, and Australia. Now, let's move. Here we go. Let's move to Vietnam society. Okay? So, Vietnam's Confucian heritage is evident in the importance of Vietnamese give to the family. Families are essentially, but Vietnamese women work alongside men in many jobs and play a major role in raising children and managing family finance. Vietnam's population will be aging rapidly in coming decades. This is a big challenge. Let's talk about Vietnam's Human Capital Index. Okay, so you can see here, Vietnam's HCI stands at 0.69, meaning a child born in Vietnam today will be 69% as productive when grow up, as this child could be enjoy complete education and full health. So this is higher than the average for East Asia and the Pacific region and lower middle income countries in the region, just behind Singapore, the ranked number one globally, and in fact even above many other world powerhouse economies like Russia, China, and India. Aging society, life expectancy, well, so the population of Vietnam in 2020 is about 98 million and is expected to expand to 120 million by 2050. And accordingly to 2020 population census report, 55% of the population is under 35 years of age, with a life expectancy of 70 years. Aging society, we can say Vietnam is enjoying its golden population now, but it means in the next 10 and 20 years, we have to face with the aging population stage. It means between 10 to 20% of more than 65 years old population. And after the period of 2050, we have to deal with a very aging population stage with 20 to 30% of elderly people. Last but not least, the opportunities and challenges. As mentioned previously, we do have huge opportunities thanks to FTA, or challenges such as aging population. There are more to consider in coming years. So just a little humor illustration. Henry Kissinger, this American, said that America has no permanent friends or enemy, only national interest. I think it's true for all nations, including Vietnam. Lesson learned from the past, we do not accept any negotiation between superpowers behind our back, like the case between US and China during the Vietnam War and the border conflict in 1980s between China and Vietnam. So we can recognize here Xi Jinping in China, Putin in Russia, and Obama back to the period of 2008 and 2016 are the key countries, Japan, India, and Australia involved. And under Trump administration, there are significant changes. And now it is the President Biden. So due to the strategic geopolitical Vietnam too close to China, this slide again shows us how complicated and complex it is for Vietnam to cooperate and deal with its key partners or influencers. RCEP Free Trade Agreement I showed you previously. BRI refers to Belt Road Initiative. CPTPP, Donald Trump withdrew from it, but many experts expect that and predict that soon US try to rejoin CPTPP, include other 11 members. Quad plus 6 Indo-Pacific strategy between US, India, Australia, and Japan is expecting to expand Quad plus 6 that involves Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, Singapore, France, and the UK. A few months ago, France sent warships to the South China Sea, and the same way UK announced HMS Queen Elizabeth is to be deployed in this region. Many things to say about challenges. Well, in terms of COVID-19 vaccination, Vietnam up to now is among the lowest in the region. So over the last 2 months, the Vietnamese government deal hardly with US and Japan, and we are receiving millions of vaccination doses and expecting by the end of this year to be able to vaccinate for over 60 to 70% of our population. So let's see. And about other challenges, we do have geopolitical tensions. As I just introduced, the dispute and conflict in the East Sea, or we can be in the middle between the trade war of US and China, the growing protectionism, which is about American first under Trump administration, or the Brexit somehow, poor banking system. Vietnam should strengthening our banking system. The rising oil prices is predicted for the end of this year. We should improve the quality of human capital. The labor cost in Vietnam is increasing. Yes, we can no longer enjoy the cheap labor. Climate change, Vietnam is among the top 10 countries in the world most damaged by climate change. We witness a lot of natural disasters every year because we have a long coastline. Okay, and Thank you very much.
In conclusion, Vietnam's foreign policy since the 1980s aimed at A. To bring out the country from isolation and integration to the world market. B. By maintaining a balanced approach between China and Western powers, Vietnamese hope to keep its independence. Hence, the Vietnamese key strategy has been a comprehensive partnership to keep the country from Sino-US competition. Overall, Vietnamese foreign policy is determined by the global situation, especially the US strategy in dealing with the Chinese rise to power. 2. The continuity of development domestically. 3. Environmental issues that are alarming at the moment. 4. Managing the COVID-19 now and after. Time will tell how the Vietnamese Communist Party will deal with these issues. Thank you.